As the title suggests, third-person multiple narration refers to the viewpoint of more than one character. This might seem a little confusing from my example in part 3 of this series, where I used the example of the Game of Thrones to demonstrate third-person limited. The confusing part for you might be when I use several different main characters, all with their own unique viewpoints. How then is that different from third-person multiple, you may ask? Time for another of my little tales. A man from the big city sat atop a large hill and stared down at three individual farms. It was the start of spring, and he watched as the three young people worked their fields, trying to get them ready to plant their crops. They had recently inherited these farms from their parents, who had either passed away or simply couldn't take on another strenuous year of farming. This was their first year taking over and were finding the workload quite taxing. The problem was, although they were young, healthy, and eager, they hadn't any motorized machinery to help them in their task. Hazley, the only girl to run her own farm, was always ridiculed by her neighbors Gorin and Olden, usually because she refused to trade in her horse for a much more practical ox, like they had. She loved her horse and vowed to never trade in her best friend and most loyal friend for a mindless animal like an ox. Now, this city man wasn't always from the big city. When he was about their age, he was a farmer. He lived on a farm not too far away, and he too intended his farm, and he too had only one horse to help him get his fields ready for sowing. But he didn't have the patience most farmers are born with, and so he left his farm and headed to the big city. It turned out to be the best decision he could have made, because in no time he had become a very wealthy man traveling across the country selling farm machinery. But watching the three young people struggling, he knew they could never afford one of his machines, and since he didn't need the money, he decided to offer each of them a way in which they could get all of the machinery they needed. His way of giving back to his community. The next morning, the three farmers met the city man at the side of the main road into town and explained why he had asked for them to meet with him. When I was about your age, I worked my farm the way you are now, but using farm animals to pull your plow is a thing of the past. Because of this, I'm going to give you a one-time opportunity. On this main road, exactly 100 miles from here, I have placed inside each truck a brand new tracker with a plow attachment and duplicated parts in the event anything needs replacing in the future. But there is a catch. Although each truck has a full tank of gas, they burn gas quickly and probably only enough to get you to the next gas station, which is in town 25 miles from where you will find your trucks. There is no other place within 100 miles of that town that sells gasoline, and they don't accept money. But they will trade anything else with you. From the moment you reach your truck, the clock starts, and you will have exactly 24 hours to get back here and not a minute later. You will be allowed to keep whatever you are able to bring back with you. By the time the two young men had made it to their trucks, they found them parked in a little clearing where a man handed each of them their keys. Hazley's truck was there, but she was nowhere to be found. Laughing at the thought of her never making it to her truck, the two young farmers got into their own trucks and drove in the direction of the nearest town. They arrived together and headed for the gas station. While they figured out what they were going to trade to get enough gasoline to make it home, Hazley had just received her keys and was preparing for the journey to the town. The look on her face showed that she hadn't had much experience in driving such a large truck, but she was in no rush. She had a full 24 hours to reach home and so drove at a slow and steady pace. Goran opened up the back of his truck and looked inside. It was indeed filled with all of the farm equipment that he could ever hope for, but would do him little, if any good, if he wasn't able to get it home. Remembering that he could only trade for the gasoline he needed, he decided to trade some of the equipment for a full tank of gas and then a few containers for the time the tank became empty. Olden stared over at Goran from his truck and realized what he was about to do. Not wanting to lose the opportunity to get one over on him, he ran over ahead of his friend and proceeded to strike up his own deal for gasoline. The gasoline owner was reluctant to part with so much gasoline at one time and decided that he would require a greater trade than he usually accepted. The three of them haggled for quite a while, but not in the young farmer's favor. The gasoline owner realized that he was in a great position to manipulate the inexperienced young men, and before too long, he had convinced them to trade everything but the actual tractor for all of the gasoline they required. With no other choice, they each started off down the road, knowing that they had enough gasoline to make it the rest of the way home. But with just 25 miles left to go, both trucks broke down. They sat at the side of the road for several hours before a random farmer tending to his fields noticed them, stopped at the side of the road, and approached them. After realizing their predicament and seeing an opportunity to make a great trade, he offered to repair each truck, but the trade would have to be everything that they were carrying. They finally agreed, figuring that they would at least end up with a truck, something they didn't have before, and far more than Hazley would end up with by the time she finally made it back home. It was late in the night when they arrived back with their trucks and a full 7 hours before the deadline. But there was no sign of Hazley. The two young farmers took comfort in the fact that they ended up with more than her. The next morning, on the 23rd hour, Hazley made it back with her truck and everything inside. Today, I'll talk about just how different third person multiple narration is, and then I'll tell you how Hazley did it. If you remember, in third person limited, the narrative is limited to one particular character, usually your main character, giving the reader an insight into that particular character's feelings, goals, etc. In Game of Thrones, because the story is segmented into different sub-stories, each comes with its own third person limited point of view. But in third person multiple, the story alternates between the perspectives of different characters. By this I mean, if you have 2, 3, or more characters in a scene where you would merely have the point of view from one main character in third person limited, in third person multiple, you will have it from the point of view of not just one, but 2, 3, or several characters. I've probably lost you. Let's use our earlier example of Doug and Roger. If you remember, in that example, the scene was told from the third person limited narrative where Doug, the narrator, was only able to see or hear what the main character, Roger, was able to see or hear. Now let's try that scene again, but this time with third person multiple. Doug listened intently outside of the bedroom. He hadn't heard any sounds coming from the other side of the door, which was a good sign. It meant his friend hadn't yet used the gun. There was still a chance he would open the door and hand it over. Roger sat at the edge of the bed and stared down at the gun in his hands. He knew that if he opened the door, his friend Doug might have been able to talk him out of doing what he knew he must do. And he knew that if he was going to save his daughter, he had to take his own life. He got it wrong the first time. Killing the man who would someday kill his great granddaughter wouldn't save her life. He now knew he hadn't changed a thing. He had to first save his daughter. But to do that, he had to travel back to the time of her birth, the year 1919, over a century earlier. He understood to accomplish this, he could no longer exist in his current time. Helen struggled to her feet. She knew he was in the house with her. She had heard the rear door latch being released. Her entire being was screaming for her to run for the front door and out onto the street for help, but she knew that with only weeks left in her pregnancy, she wouldn't make it to the door in time. She had hoped to bring in the new year quietly in front of the radio with her husband Roger. Oh, how she loved him. But he had a habit of always being absent when she needed him most. But she couldn't help it. She would wait until the end of time for her one true love to return to her. Alone with a killer in the house, she feared that she wouldn't live long enough to see the arrival of 1920. She feared her baby would never be born. In this example, you'll notice the narrator follows three characters, all separate and distinctive. Because of this unique point of view, the narrator can know what each of the characters are doing. He is even able to travel back in time and follow the character Helen as she tries to evade a killer in her house. You see, with good narration, it becomes quite evident with the changing of characters. Through descriptive words such as, he listened intently outside, or he hadn't heard any sounds coming from inside the room, help the reader to know Doug is the character in question without needing to say his name. And descriptive words like stared down at the gun in his hands and he had to take his own life help the reader to know Roger is the character in question. And finally, descriptive words like she knew he was in the house with her. She had heard the door's latch being released. These help the reader to know Helen is the character in question. The reason the narrator shouldn't rely on a character's name to show a change of point of view is because depending on how many times the story switches between characters, continually stating their name can be a bit redundant and annoying to your reader. Earlier, I told you how Game of Thrones was the example for third person limited and how it differed from third person multiple. The thing is, it actually represents both. Combining different points of view in a single story is risky if not done correctly, so it is best to refrain from doing so. But in a few cases, the Game of Thrones, for example, the writer was able to deliver the story in the narrative of third person limited as well as third person multiple. I've already explained how this was accomplished with third person limited. Now I'll explain how it was also accomplished with third person multiple. Remember I said how Game of Thrones is one main story made up of segmented sub-stories that converge? Well, Game of Thrones is actually 5 individual books telling one story. So if you can imagine that with any average novel, there are several characters. With 5 books, there are at least 5 times as many. You would also expect to find several main characters, many secondary characters, and countless minor characters. Having said that, A story of this magnitude cannot be so easily told from the perspective of just a handful of main characters, like the few I mentioned in the previous video. With Jon Snow as a main character, it aids the story to utilize the ability to tell the story in part from the point of view of one of the secondary characters, such as his best friend, Sam Tarly, or Tyrion Lannister and his relationship with the secondary character, Jorah Mormont, who has the unique perspective of his relationship with another main character, Daenerys Targaryen. By switching viewpoints between these main characters in their respective sub-stories, but also switching viewpoints amongst their secondary characters, you are also telling your story from the point of view of the third person multiple. But like I said earlier, try to refrain from combining points of view in your single story. You run the risk of confusing your reader, and if you don't actually need to tell your story from different viewpoints, then simply don't. Now, keeping with third person multiple in mind, it goes without saying that this type of narration is usually only used when you have several characters in your story, and those characters need also to be important enough to be given the honor of helping to tell your story from their own point of view. It's like giving several cooks in the kitchen the title chef. Have you ever heard the saying, too many cooks spoil the broth? It's because with having more than enough people cooking a meal, putting in their own special ingredients that don't necessarily work with other special ingredients, in the end, you end up with a spoiled meal. Where your story is concerned, if you are able to tell it with only one or a couple of points of view, then to incorporate the viewpoints of several more narrators can only serve to hinder the objective of your story. Heard the saying, less is more? If you can deliver an amazing meal with just one or two cooks, then why bother to hire others? The same goes for your story. If you can deliver an amazing story with the viewpoints of just one or two narrators, then why add more? You've already achieved your goal. What could you hope to further achieve by giving you and your reader more work? Too many narrators confuse the story. Now, I didn't say many narrators confuse the story, I said too many do. There is a difference. For example, if your story will be better off told from the viewpoints of several narrators, like in the Game of Thrones, then by all means add them in. As a matter of fact, in a large character story like Game of Thrones, you would probably do your story an injustice by trying to tell it from the viewpoint of too few narrators. In this circumstance, writing a 5-book novel like Game of Thrones probably requires many narrators. If 5 or even 10 points of view is what's needed to properly tell your story, then 5 or 10 points of view isn't too many. Just remember, the beauty of the third person multiple is that whether you need to tell your story from the viewpoint of just 2 people for a short story or 20 viewpoints for an ongoing series, it's there to help you get your story's point across. And now I'll tell you the ending to the story I call Never Give Up on the Past. Hazley meant it when she said her horse was her best friend and loyal. So while Goran and Olden flagged down a ride to take them to their trucks, she went into her barn and brought out her horse, Cinnamon, and then rode her down the road in the direction of her truck. It took them all night to reach her truck, but by morning she had it started and ready to drive it home. But there was a very good reason why her dying father's wish was for her to run the family farm and not her brother Tate. And that was because she was extremely intelligent and very innovative. Knowing that she would have to stop off at the town on her way home, she decided to stop there on her way up to her truck, and while there, made a deal. But she didn't make a deal for gasoline. She made a deal for 20 pounds of hay and a few gallons of water. And since she hadn't any intention of acquiring any gasoline, she was able to use the money she had traveled with to buy what she needed. And now you're probably wondering how she was able to get the truck and everything inside back home without trading for gasoline. Well, remember I said she's very innovative. And she didn't just bring Cinnamon along for company. She had also brought along a harness and some rope. On the way back home, after stopping off at the town to pick up the hay and water, she had Cinnamon, with the harness on and a rope tied to the front of the truck, pull the truck in the direction of home. After a while, when her horse had become too tired to pull, Hazley started up the truck and drove for a few miles while Cinnamon walked behind the truck with the back door open so she could eat the hay and drink the water. Then, when she had a sufficient rest, around the time that the truck was showing signs of strain on the engine, she shut it off to preserve the gasoline, and Cinnamon continued pulling the truck in the direction of home. It was an easy pull, a great deal easier than pulling the plow on the farm every day, and besides, the journey back home was all downhill. So when she arrived back home with an hour to spare, Goran and Olden were there with the intention of mocking her for losing, but were soon envious of her when they realized that she had outsmarted them both. Thanks for watching, and if you found anything that I said beneficial to you in any way, hit that subscribe button because you never know, my next video might just be helpful too.